Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. So, I've just finished reading this book, which is the last book in the Spider-World series by Colin Wilson. And I really enjoyed this series. I think it's a really fascinating series. And I think it definitely deserves to get more attention. Not a lot of people know about this series. It barely gets a mention on BookTube, as far as I can tell. So I thought I'd spread the word a little bit and give this series a bit of an overview in this video, introduce what they're about, my thoughts on each book, and why I recommend this series as a whole. I'll be careful to avoid any spoilers. So these books were written by Colin Wilson, who was an English author who was quite prolific, and he worked in many different fields, not just fiction, but also non-fiction. He wrote a few sci-fi horror novels in the 60s and 70s. I've not read anything by him besides the series, but anyway, Spider-World was born in the 1980s. Okay, it became a 4-volume series, a tetralogy, published between 1987 and 2003. And it's essentially a post-apocalyptic tale that strads a number of genres and narrative styles. So while at its heart it is a science fiction adventure, across the series we get strong elements of high fantasy, sci-fi horror, dystopian thriller, coming of age, philosophy, mysticism, even detective fiction. So throughout the series, there is some very creative and immersive world building that for me is part of its main attraction. This is a world in which we're several centuries into the future and the human population has been drastically reduced, and giant telepathic spiders roam the earth. So that's quite an intriguing setup, and it's got quite an intricate backstory in which we learn that in the 22nd century, a giant radioactive comet brushes the earth, and this wipes out most animal life on Earth. Most of humanity has fled on space transports to a planet on another star system. And the people who get left behind kind of regress to a lower technological state, and records are lost. And the situation we have with the spiders is that this comet contained the seeds of a strange and powerful vegetable life form from a distant planet. And these seeds ended up on Earth, and these have the effect of transmitting a mysterious vital energy which flows throughout the Earth and accelerates massively the process of evolution for the creatures that are capable of receiving these vibrations. So it doesn't affect all life in the same way, but for insects and bugs, it has the effects of making them giant within a few generations. And for spiders, who are the most receptive of all species, it not only increases their size, but also their intelligence, and gives them telepathic powers. And this is how they ended up replacing humans as the dominant species of Earth. So that's how things have gone in the backstory. Alongside the spiders, we also have another intelligent, uplifted species of bombardier beetles, whom the spiders have formed some kind of uneasy alliance with. Enter the first book, which is called the Tower. This was published in 1987. I've got this beautiful hardback here with a wraparound cover, Chris Foss cover art, which I really like. So I found this book in a secondhand bookshop, and this is how I discovered this series. So in this book, we follow the series protagonist, a young man called Neil, who lives out in the desert with his family, and his adventures as he grows up in this environment and the bizarre and dangerous life forms which he and his family encounter. And throughout the narrative, he eventually has a kind of coming of age scenario. He journeys into the city of the spiders who have enslaved mankind and comes into contact with their leader, the fearsome Spider Lord. And this is kind of the story of his quest to discover himself, learn to harness his latent mental powers, his remarkable psychic abilities, and ultimately fight the spider regime and form a human resistance movement. Now, I've talked about this novel in more detail in my book review a few weeks back, so if you can have a look at that if you want to learn more. But I really love this book. It's a very rich and fascinating post-apocalyptic world that Wilson created. The concepts are really interesting, and the story's fast-paced and engaging. I gave this book 5 stars. It's one of my reading highlights of the year so far. So this book is divided into 3 sections. I'll just show you. They're called the Desert, the Tower, and the Fortress. And you will find that there are some editions of this book, the US editions, published by Ace Books, I think, where these were published as 3 separate volumes under those titles. So that's the Tower. And then moving on to the second book, this one is called The Delta. Okay, I don't have a hardback of this one. I've got this trade paperback. This one was also published in 1987. And once again, we've got a lovely Chris Foss cover with a huge spider web. So in this book, Neil sets off on a new quest with his fellow humans, fellow rebels, to a region of Earth known as the Delta. And this is the home of a mysterious entity known as the Empress Plant, which is an extraterrestrial creature from this distant planet, which I mentioned earlier, which the spiders worship as a goddess, and it's the source of their power. So Neil goes on this journey with the hope to subdue the Empress Plant as a means of defeating the spiders. So this was a really enjoyable adventure with, again, some very colourful and creative world building, fascinating dangers around every corner, including a forest of man-eating carnivorous plants which hypnotize their prey. I really enjoyed this story. It's a 4.5-star read for me, I think. The only reason I don't give it 5 stars is it doesn't quite have the same freshness of its appeal that the first book had. But it's still a very satisfying read, and it closes the main narrative arc that started in the Tower. And then we have book 3, which is called The Magician. This book came out in 1992. And again, we've got another beautiful Chris Foss cover art with a giant spider web. Let's wrap around again. Now, while the first 2 books were clearly meant as a single story, which is eventually resolved in book 2, this book takes place uh, in a future storyline. I think it's something like 6 months after the events of the second book, and it's a totally different story. Um, this takes place in the Spider City sometime after the events of the Delta, and we have a new equilibrium following the events that have taken place in the last book. And the events in this story are sparked off by a murder, a mysterious murder of a high-ranking official, which takes place at the start of the story. And along the so Neil goes out to investigate this murder, and along the way we learn of this shadowy and powerful malign being known as the Magician, who ends up poisoning Neil's brother, and Neil has to find a way to save him. So that's the basic premise of this story. You can see it's a little bit different to the narrative in the first two books. We learn a whole lot more backstory in this book about the spiders and the rise of spider civilization and their conflicts with humanity in the past, and how human-spider relationships have evolved throughout the ages. So this book has got a bit of a different tone to the first book. It's definitely less fast-paced. There's less adventure, less action, a bit more in the way of character development, more backstory, more world building. But overall, it felt a bit disjointed to me. I don't think it's as exciting or as engaging as the other books. And the story also ends very abruptly. So it's still a worthwhile read, but it can't match the standard set by the Tower and the Delta. So I gave this book 3 stars. If the series ended here, that would be quite a disappointing finish. And in fact, the 4th book wasn't published until 11 years later in 2003. So eventually he did manage to resolve some of the plot points in The Magician. This novel is called Shadowland. And no Chris Foss cover art this time, sadly. This one was published by a different publisher, Hampton Roads, who brought the series back into print in the early 2000s and released the 4th and final book. So in this volume, we finally get a resolution to the story set up in The Magician. Neil sets out on his quest to save his brother, seek out the Magician so he can save his brother's life. So this character called the Magician, he lives in a kind of mysterious, semi-legendary underground city known as Shadowland. And in order to get there, Neil must go on this epic journey into the wilderness. It's not just a physical journey, it's also a kind of a spiritual journey, a journey of discovery. The fantasy vibes in this one are particularly strong. Along his journey, Neil comes into contact with various fantastical creatures, such as trolls and elemental spirits. And there are also mystical themes which have been present throughout the series, but they really come to the fore in this one. Things like animism, psychic powers, and astral projection. This is by far the slowest paced of the 4 books. Some of the book was a real slog to get through, especially the first 100 pages or so. But eventually, things start to get more interesting when more characters get introduced and Neil finally enters Shadowland. And that's where things start to get particularly intriguing and exciting even. And this is where Colin Wilson really shows off his craft for creating excellent dystopian science fiction and fantasy world building. So the plot threads that were introduced in book 3 get resolved at last, and we get what I felt was quite a satisfying conclusion. And this is a book that very much gets better as you read it. Uh, it starts off very slow, and I wasn't really enjoying it to start with. Like I said, the first 100 pages, I would say that's a 2-star read for me. Things gradually get better, and then by the time you get to the final 100 pages, it's more like a 4-star read. So overall, I would give this book 3.5 stars. A little bit better than The Magician, but still not quite up to the standard of the first 2 books. So those are the 4 books. I do highly recommend the series as a whole. I'm really glad I read it. I think this is a series that could appeal to fantasy readers as much as sci-fi fans, as there are a number of fantasy tropes and themes throughout. You could say it falls within the science fantasy hybrid genre. And as I've kind of identified, the way the series is set up, there are really 2 main story arcs. Books 1 and 2, the storyline in books 1 and 2, and the books 3 and 4 storyline. And definitely the book 1 and 2 storyline is more enjoyable to read overall. So you could just read the first 2 books. They stand alone as an excellent duology, and you could stop there. But if you want to explore this world some more and develop the story further, there's certainly no harm in continuing the series. So that's all for today. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you intend to, and I'll see you again soon.